The BFG by Roald Dahl, read by Geoffrey Palmer. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right onto her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by on the street. Not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called the witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. Sophie decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out. Even if you said you had to go to the lavatory, that was not accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses that lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on. Then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window, to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. The longing to look out became so strong, she couldn't resist it. Quickly, she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. Sophie allowed her eye to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black, something tall and black, something very tall and very black and very thin. It wasn't a human. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall its head was higher than the upstairs windows of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On and on it came, nearer and nearer. But it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on, then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house in the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs window. That's how tall it was. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously, it wasn't a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that was what he was wearing a long, black cloak. In one hand he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Goochie's house. The Goochies had a greengrocer's shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived above the shop. The two Goochie children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Goochie were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace and put the suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened the suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the end of the long trumpet thing. Sophie saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the upstairs window of the room where the Goochie children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath and, whoof, he blew through the trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Goochie children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright, flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. After a minute or so, she lifted the corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person, staring in. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes, had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window smothered in a blanket. What happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. "The giant is running fast," she told herself, "because he is hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast." The giant ran on and on. But now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was travelling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. Sophie crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. His great chest was heaving in and out. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side, as easily as if it had been a football, and now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large, the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there wasn't a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go the blanket completely. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He's getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high, rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. And in the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What have us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. He sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. "Please, don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-goblin cannibal," he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all canny-bully and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch!" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey. Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks? What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting, ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of Turkey. I suppose they would, Sophie said. Of course they would. Every human being is diddly and different. Greeks is all full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks, ever. Why not? Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy. I imagine that's possible too, Sophie said. As I am saying, all human beings is having different flavours. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable. But the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human being. The human being has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue any more. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavours. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There's something very fishy about Wales. You mean Wales, Sophie said. Wales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobblefunk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys? Sophie said. You are once again gobblefunking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs. Of course. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do people of Labrador taste of? Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me? Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. But if you are so nice and friendly, then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me. If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away hip-switch. Why? Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist. I do. Ah, but that is only because you have seen me. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you'd be doing, you'd be scuttling around yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. And then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world. People would be coming rushing and bushing after me, and they would be catching me and locking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into the zoo or the bunkum house with all those squiggling hippo dumplings and crocodile dillies. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. I will bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would. And if you go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG. "Most likely on the telly bunkum box and the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life."
"Oh, no."
"Oh, yes. But I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about out of this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one tiny little glimpse of you." The big friendly giant picked Sophie off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the big stone to one side and said, "Peep over there, little girl. Tell me what you is seeing." Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving over the rocks about 500 yards away. "This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants. Every one." It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were! Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" "Nothing," said the BFG. "They is just moochling and foochling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers." "Do they ever go to England?" Sophie asked. "Often. They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of Frobscottle." "I'm not sure I quite know what that means." "Meanings is not important," said the BFG. "And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people?" "All of them is guzzling human beings every night." "But eating people is horrible," Sophie cried. "Why doesn't someone stop them?" "And who, please, is going to be stopping them?" "Couldn't you?" "Never in a pig's whistle," cried the BFG. "All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. I is the runt. I is 24 feet. That is puddle nuts in giant country." "Oh, you mustn't feel bad about it," Sophie said. "I think you're just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages." "Bigger," said the BFG, looking pleased. "They is as big as bumple hammers." "How many giants are there out there?" 9 altogether." "That means that somewhere in the world every single night 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive." "More. It's all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before he's feeling full up. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger." "But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world?" All countries except Greece." "And if you were to put me on the ground and I was to walk out among them now," Sophie said, "would they really eat me up?" "Like a whiff swiddle. First one to be seeing you would pick you up in his fingers and down you'd go like a drop of drain water." "Let's go back inside," Sophie said. "I hate even watching them." Back in the cave, the big friendly giant sat Sophie down once again on the enormous table. "Is you quite snugly there in your nightie? You isn't frigid cold?" "I'm fine," Sophie said. "I cannot help thinking about your poor mother and father. By now they must be jipping and scumping all over the house, shouting, 'Hello, hello, where is Sophie gone?'" "I don't have a mother and father," Sophie said. "They both died when I was a baby." "Oh, you poor little scrumplet. Is she not missing them very badly?" "Not really, because I never knew them." "Oh, you is making me sad," the BFG said, rubbing his eyes. "Don't be sad. No one's going to be worrying too much about me. That place you took me from was the village orphanage."
"You is a orphan?"
"Yes."
"How many is there in there?"
10 of us, all little girls."
"Was you happy there?"
"I hated it," Sophie said. "The woman who ran it was called Mrs. Clonkers, and if she caught you breaking any of the rules, like getting out of bed at night or not folding up your clothes, you got punished."
"How was you getting punished?"
"She locked us in the dark cellar for a day and a night without anything to eat or drink."
"The rotten old rat rasper."
"It was horrid. There were rats down there. We could hear them creeping about."
"The filthy old fizzwiggler. You is making me sadder than ever."
All at once, a huge tear that would have filled a bucket rolled down one of the BFG's cheeks and fell with a splash on the floor. Sophie watched in astonishment. What a strange and moody creature this is, she thought. "The thing that worries me," Sophie said, "is having to stay in this dreadful place for the rest of my life. The orphanage was pretty awful, but I wouldn't have been there forever, would I?"
"All is my fault," the BFG said. "I is the one who kid-snatched you."
"Now I come to think of it, I won't actually be here all that long."
"I is afraid you will."
"No, I won't. Those brutes out there are bound to catch me sooner or later and have me for tea."
"I is never letting that happen."
For a few moments the cave was silent. Then Sophie said, "May I ask you a question?" The BFG wiped the tears from his eyes.
"Shoot away,"
he said. "Would you please tell me what you were doing in our village last night? Why were you poking that long trumpet thing into the Gucci children's bedroom?"
"Aha!" cried the BFG. "Now we is getting nosier than a Parker."
"And the suitcase you were carrying, what on earth was that all about?"
The BFG stared suspiciously. "You is making me tell you whopsy big secrets that nobody has ever hearing before."
"I won't tell a soul, I swear it. Well, how could I, anyway? I'm stuck here for the rest of my life." "Oh, please tell me what you were doing in our village. I promise you can trust me."
"Would you teach me how to make an elephant?" the BFG asked.
"What do you mean?"
"I would dearly love to have an elephant to ride on," the BFG said dreamily. "I would so much love to have a jumbly big elephant and go riding through green forests picking peachy fruits off the trees all day long. This is a sizzling hot muck-frumping country we is living in. Nothing grows in it except snos-cumbers."
Sophie was quite moved by this curious statement. "Perhaps one day we will get you an elephant," she said, "and peachy fruits as well. Now, tell me what you were doing in our village."
"If you is really wanting to know what I'm doing in your village," the BFG said, "I is blowing a dream into the bedroom of those children."
"Blowing a dream? What do you mean?"
"I is a dream-blowing giant," the BFG said. "When all the other giants is galloping off every what way and which to swallow up human beings, I is scuttling away to other places to blow dreams into the bedrooms of sleeping children. Lovely golden dreams. Dreams that is giving the dreamers a happy time."
"Now, hang on a minute," Sophie said. "Where do you get these dreams?"
"I collect them,"
the BFG said, waving an arm towards all the rows and rows of bottles on the shelves.
"I has billions of them."
"You cannot collect a dream."
"You is never going to understand about it. That is why I is not wishing to tell you."
"Oh, please tell me. I will understand. Tell me how you collect dreams." The BFG settled himself comfortably in his chair and crossed his legs.
"Dreams is very mysterious things. They's floating around in the air like little wispy misty bubbles, and all the time they is searching for sleeping people.
Can you see them?
Never at first.
Then how do you catch them if you can't see them?
Aha, said the BFG. Now we is getting onto the dark and dusky secrets. A dream, as it goes whiffling through the night air, is making a tiny little buzzing humming noise. But this little buzzy hum is so silvery soft it is impossible for a human being to be hearing it.
Can you hear it?
The BFG pointed up at his enormous truck-wheel ears, which he now began to move in and out. Is you seeing these? How could I miss them? Sophie said. They may be as looking a bit preposterous to you, but you must believe me when I say they is very extra-usual ears indeed. They is not to be coughed at. They is allowing me to hear absolutely every single twiddly little thing.
You mean you can hear things that I can't hear?
You is deaf as a dumpling compared with me. You is hearing only thumping loud noises with those little earwigs of yours, but I am hearing all the secret whisperings of the world.
Such as what?
And in your country, I is hearing the footsteps of a ladybird as she goes walking across a leaf.
Honestly?
What's more, I is hearing those footsteps very loud. When a ladybird is walking across a leaf, I is hearing her feet going clumpety-clumpety-clump like giant's footsteps.
Good gracious me, Sophie said. What else can you hear?
I is hearing the little ants chittering to each other as they scuttle around in the soil, and sometimes on a very clear night, and if I is swiggling my ears in the right direction. And here he swiveled his great ears upwards, so that they were facing the ceiling. If I is swiggling them like this, and the night is very clear, I is sometimes hearing far-away music coming from the stars in the sky. A queer little shiver passed through Sophie's body. My ears is what told me you was watching me out of your window last night, the BFG said.
But I didn't make a sound, Sophie said.
I was hearing your heart beating across the road, loud as a drum.
Go on, please.
I can hear plants and trees.
Do they talk?
They's not exactly talking, but they is making noises. For instance, if I come along and I is picking a lovely flower, if I is twisting the stem of the flower till it breaks, then plant is screaming and screaming very clear.
You don't mean it. How awful! Is that really true?
You think I is swizfiggling you?
Well, it is rather hard to believe.
Then I is stopping right here, said the BFG sharply. I is not wishing to be called a fibster.
Oh, no, I'm not calling you anything. I believe you. Please, go on.
The BFG gave her a long, hard stare.
Sophie looked right back at him, her face open to his. I believe you, she said softly. She had offended him, she could see that. So do, please forgive me and go on, she said.
The BFG waited a while longer, and then he said, Such wonderful and terrible sounds I is hearing. Some of them you never wish to be hearing yourself. But some is like glorious music.
He seemed almost to be transfigured by the excitement of his thoughts. His face was beautiful in its blaze of emotions. Tell me some more about them, Sophie said quietly.
Well, you just ought to be hearing the little mices talking. Little mices is always talking to each other, and I is hearing them as loud as my own voice.
Who else do you hear? Sophie asked.
One of the biggest chat bags is the cattle peddlers, BFG said.
What do they say?
They is arguing all the time about who is going to be the prettiest butterfly.
Is there a dream floating around in here now? Sophie asked. The BFG moved his great ears this way and that, listening intently. He shook his head.
There is no dream in here, he said, except in the bottles. I has a special place to go for catching dreams. They's not often coming to giant country.
How do you catch them?
Well, same way you's catching butterflies with a net.
The BFG stood up and crossed over to a corner of the cave where a pole was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net on the end of it.
Here is the dream catcher. Every morning I's going out and snitching new dreams to put in my bottles.
Suddenly, he seemed to lose interest in the conversation.
I's getting hungry. He said it is time for eats.
But if you don't eat people, what do you live on?
That is a squelching tricky problem around here. In this slosh-flunking giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pigwinkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky-poo vegetable. It is called the snos-cumber.
The snos-cumber? Cried Sophie. There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square white teeth.
Yesterday we wasn't believing in giants, was we? Today we is not believing in snos-cumbers. Just because we happen not to have actually seen something where there are two little winkles, we think it is not existing. What about, for instance, the great squizzly Scotch hopper?
I beg your pardon? Sophie said.
And the humple crimp and the rat rascal.
Are they animals? Sophie asked.
They is common animals. I is not a very know-all giant myself, but it seems to me that you is an absolutely know-nothing human being. Your brain is full of rotten wool.
You mean cotton wool?
What I mean and what I say is two different things, the BFG announced rather grandly. I will now show you a snos-cumber.
The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest-looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long again as an ordinary man, but was much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as a perambulator. It was black, with white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobbles.
Here is the repulsant snos-cumber, cried the BFG, waving it about. I squaggle it, I mispies it, I disspunge it. But because I is refusing to gobble up human beings like the other giants, I must spend my life guzzling up icky-poo snos-cumbers instead. If I don't, I'll be nothing but skin and groans.
You mean skin and bones?
I know it is bones, the BFG said. But please understand that I cannot be helping it if sometimes I is saying things a little squiggly. I is trying my very best all the time.
The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude.
There never was any schools to teach me talking in giant country, the BFG said sadly.
But couldn't your mother have taught you?
My mother? Giants don't have mothers. Surely you was knowing that.
I didn't know that.
Who ever heard of a woman giant? There never was woman giant, and there never will be. Giants is always men.
In that case, how were you born?
Giants isn't born. Giants appears.
And when did you appear? Sophie asked.
Now, how on earth could I be know anything like that? So long ago I couldn't count.
You mean you don't even know how old you are?
Well, no giant is knowing that. All I's knowing about myself is that I is very old. Very, very old and crumply. Perhaps as old as the earth.
What happens when a giant dies?
Giants is never dying. Sometimes. Quite suddenly a giant is disappearing, and nobody is ever knowing where he goes to, but mostly us giants is simply going on and on like whiffsy time twiddlers.
The BFG was still holding the awesome snos-cumber in his right hand, and now he put one end of it into his mouth and bit off a huge chunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like the crunching of lumps of ice.
"Ugh, it's filthing,"
he spluttered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of snos-cumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on the tabletop, ducking out of the way.
"Ugh, that's disgustous. Try it yourself, this foulsome snos-cumber."
"No, thank you," Sophie said, backing away.
"That's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it. Go on, you snipsy little winkle, have a go."
Sophie took a small nibble.
"Oh, no! Oh, gosh! Oh, help!"
She spat it out quickly. "It tastes of frog skins and rotten fish. Do we really have to eat it?"
"You do, unless you is wanting to become so thin you'll be disappearing into a thick ear."
"Into thin air. A thick ear is something quite different." Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes.
"Words is all such a twitch-tickling problem to me all my life. I know exactly what words I'm wanting to say, but somehow or other they is all getting squiddled around."
"That happens to everyone."
"Not like it happens to me."
"I think you speak beautifully."
"You do?"
cried the BFG, suddenly brightening.
"That is the nicest present anybody has given me in my whole life. Are you sure you is not twiddling my leg?"
"Of course not. I just love the way you talk."
"How wonder, Crump! How whoopsie-splunkers!"
"Listen, we don't have to eat snos-cumbers. In the fields around our village there are all sorts of lovely vegetables like cauliflowers and carrots. Why don't you get some of those next time you go visiting?" The BFG raised his great hand proudly in the air.
"I is a very honourable giant. I would rather be chewing up rotsome snos-cumbers than snitching things from other people."
"You stole me."
"I didn't steal you very much," said the BFG, smiling gently. "After all, you is only a tiny little girl."
Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted,
"Runt! I is hearing you jabbering. Who is you jabbering to, Runt?"
"Look out!" cried the BFG. "It's the blood bottler." But before he'd finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked, except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten snos-cumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG.
"Who was you jabbering to in here just now?"
he boomed.
"I is jabbling to myself," the BFG answered. "Piffle fizz, you is talking to a human being, that's what I is thinking."
"No, no."
"Yes, yes," boomed the blood bottler. "I is guessing you has snitched away a human being, so now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper."
The poor BFG was very nervous.
"There's no one in here. Why don't you leave me alone?"
The blood bottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG.
"Runty little scrum-screwer," he shouted. "I is now going to search the primroses."
He grabbed the BFG by the arm.
"And you is going to help me do it."
The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back, but now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous snos-cumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The blood bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish-brown. There was black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy-looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small and flat. But the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying one on top of the other. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down over the chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The blood bottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and rows of bottles.
"You and your pibbling bottles! What's you putting in them?"
"Nothing that would interest you," the BFG answered. "You was only interested in guzzling human beings."
"And you is dirty as a dog's waggler!"
Soon the blood bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. The snos-cumber, although it was as thick as a perambulator, was not going to hide her if the blood bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of these seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the snos-cumber, large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. The blood bottler and the BFG were coming back towards the table now, and suddenly the blood bottler grabbed the half-eaten snos-cumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. "Sophie, where is you?" he thought desperately.
"So, this is the filthing, rotsome glabbage you is eating. You must be cockles to be guzzling such rub-squash."
For a moment the blood bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track.
"That is the scrumdiddlyumptious snos-cumber. I is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. Is you never trying a snos-cumber, blood bottler? Human beings is juicier."
"You is talking rummy-tot," the BFG said. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavour would send him bellowing out of the cave.
"I's happy to let you sample it."
The blood bottler stared suspiciously, with small piggy eyes, at the snos-cumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over.
"You is not switch-fiddling me, is you?"
said the blood bottler.
"Never!" cried the BFG passionately. "Take a bite, and I'm positive you'll be shouting out how scrumdiddlyumptious this wonder veg is."
The BFG could see the greedy blood bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. He picked up the snos-cumber. He began raising it on its long journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, "Don't!" but that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up. Suddenly, there was a crunch as the blood bottler bit a huge hunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat.
roared the blood bottler. And then he spat. All of the great lumps of snos-cumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched.
"You little swine bugger!"
roared the blood bottler. He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the snos-cumber over his head. "Why, you is not loving it?" the BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head.
"Loving it? You must be buggles to be swallowing such like that. Every night you can be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juicy human beans."
"Eating human beings is wrong and evil."
"It is guzzly and glumptious," shouted the blood bottler. "And tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few human chili beans."
"Horrible," the BFG said. "You ought to be ashamed." "Other giants is all saying they's wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school chidlers. I is very fond of English school chidlers. They has a nice inky, booky flavour. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them." "You is disgusting."
"And you is an insult to the giant peoples. You is not fit to be a giant."
And with that, the horrible, blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. "Sophie!" he whispered. "Sophie! Where is you, Sophie?" Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. "I'm here," she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. "Oh, I is so happy to be finding you all in one lump." "I was in his mouth," Sophie said.
"You was what?"
Sophie told him what had happened. "You is all covered in snos-cumber and giant spit," he set about cleaning her up as best he could. "I is hating those other giants more than ever now. You know what I should like?"
"What?"
"I should like to find a way of disappearing them. Every single one."
"I'd be glad to help you. Let me see if I can think up a way of doing it."
By now, Sophie was beginning to feel not only extremely hungry, but very thirsty as well.
"Are you sure there's nothing else to eat around here except those disgusting smelly snos-cumbers?" she asked.
Not even a fizzwinkle."
"In that case, may I please have a little water?"
"Water?" said the BFG, frowning mightily. "What is water?"
"We drink it." "What do you drink?"
"Frobscottle. All giants is drinking Frobscottle."
"Is it as nasty as your snos-cumbers?"
"Nasty? Never is it nasty. Frobscottle is sweet and jumbly." The BFG got up from his chair and went to a huge cupboard. He opened it and took out a glass bottle that must have been 6 feet tall. The liquid inside it was pale green, and the bottle was half full. "Here is Frobscottle, delumptuous, fizzy Frobscottle." He gave it a shake, and the green stuff began to fizz like mad.
"But look! It's fizzing the wrong way!"
Sophie cried, and indeed it was. The bubbles, instead of travelling upwards and bursting on the surface, were shooting downwards and bursting at the bottom. "What on earth did you mean in the wrong way?" asked the BFG.
"In our fizzy drinks, the bubbles always go up and burst at the top."
"Upwards is the wrong way," cried the BFG. "You mustn't ever be having bubbles going upwards. That the most flush-bunking rubbish I ever is hearing. It is a flush-bunking and a scrotty mistake to let the bubbles go upwards.
Why shouldn't the bubbles go upward?
I will explain, but tell me first what name is you calling your Frobscottle by?
One is Coke, another is Pepsi. There are lots of them.
And the bubbles is all going up?
They all go up.
A catastrophe!
Will you please tell me why?
If you will listen carefully, I will try to explain, said the BFG. When you is drinking this cokey drink of yours, it is going straight down to your tummy, is that right? Or is it left?
It's right, Sophie said.
And the bubbles is going also into your tummy, right or left?
Right again.
And the bubbles is fizzing upwards?
Of course.
Which means that they will all come swish-whiffling up your throat and out of your mouth and make a foulsome, belchy burp.
That is often true, but it's sort of fun.
Burping is filthsome. Us giants is never doing it.
But with your drink,
what was it you called it? Frobscottle, said the BFG.
With Frobscottle, the bubbles in your tummy will be going downwards, and that could have a far nastier result.
Why nasty?
Because, Sophie said, blushing a little, if they go down instead of up, they'll be coming out somewhere else with an even louder and ruder noise.
A whiz-popper, cried the BFG, beaming at her. Us giants is making whiz-poppers all the time. Whiz-popping is a sign of happiness. You surely is not telling me that a little whiz-popping is forbidden among human beings?
It is considered extremely rude, Sophie said.
But you is whiz-popping, is you not? Now and again? Asked the BFG.
Oh, everyone is whiz-popping, if that's what you call it, Sophie said. Kings and queens are whiz-popping. Presidents are whiz-popping. But where I come from, it is not polite to talk about it.
Redunculous! We is now having a swiggle of this delicious Frobscottle, and you will see the happy result.
The BFG shook the bottle vigorously. The pale green stuff fizzed and bubbled. He removed the cork and took a tremendous, gurgling swig.
It's glummy, he cried. I love it.
For a few moments the big friendly giant stood quite still, and a look of absolute ecstasy began to spread over his long, wrinkly face. Then, suddenly, the heavens opened, and he let fly with a series of the loudest and rudest noises Sophie had ever heard in her life. But most astonishing of all, the force of the explosions actually lifted the enormous giant clear off his feet, like a rocket.
Whoopee! He cried when he came down to earth again. Now that is whiz-popping for you.
Sophie burst out laughing. She couldn't help it.
Have some yourself, cried the BFG,
tipping the neck of the enormous bottle towards her. Sophie opened her mouth, and very gently the BFG tipped the bottle forward and poured some of the fabulous Frobscottle down her throat. And, oh gosh, how delicious it was! It was sweet and refreshing. It tasted of vanilla and cream, with just the faintest trace of raspberries on the edge of the flavour. It's lovely, she cried.
Just wait.
Sophie could feel the bubbles travelling lower and lower down her tummy, and then suddenly, inevitably, the explosion came. The trumpet sounded, and she too made the walls of the cavern ring with the sound of music and thunder.
"Bravo!" shouted the BFG, waving the bottle. "Let's have some more!"
Side 2. After the mad Frobscottle party was over, Sophie settled herself again on top of the enormous table.
"You's galloping off now," the BFG said, "to catch some more wopsy-whiffling dreams for my collection. I's doing this every day without missing. Is you wishing to come with me?"
Not me, thank you very much," Sophie said. "Not with those other giants lurking outside."
"I is snuggling you very cosy into the pocket of my waistcoat. Then no one is seeing you."
Before Sophie could protest, he had picked her up off the table and popped her into the waistcoat pocket.
"Is you wishing for a little hole to peep out from?"
"There's one here already." Sophie had found a small hole in the pocket, and when she put one eye close to it, she could see out very well indeed. She watched the BFG as he bent down and filled his suitcase with empty glass jars. He closed the lid, picked up the suitcase in one hand, took the pole with the net on the end in the other hand, and marched towards the entrance of the cave. As soon as he was outside, the BFG set off across the great, hot, yellow wasteland. Sophie, squatting low on her heels in the pocket of the leather waistcoat, had one eye glued to the little hole. She saw the group of enormous giants about 300 yards ahead.
"Hold your breaths," the BFG whispered down to her. "Cross your figures. Here we go. We is going right past all these other giants. Is you seeing that whopping great one, the one nearest to us?" "I see him." "That is the horriblest of them all. He is called the flesh-lump-eating giant."
"I don't want to hear about him."
"He is 54 feet high," the BFG said softly as he jogged along, "and he is swallowing human beings like they is sugar lumps 2 or 3 at a time."
"Keep away from him," Sophie pleaded.
"Not possible," the BFG answered. "He is galloping easily 2 times as quicksy as me."
"Shall we turn back?" Sophie said.
"Turning back is worse. If they is seeing me running away, they is all giving chase and throwing rocks."
"They would never eat you, though, would they?"
"Giants is never guzzling other giants. They is fighting and squarreling a lot with each other, but never guzzling. Human beings is more tasty to them."
The giants had already spotted the BFG, and all heads were turned, watching him as he jogged forward. He was aiming to pass well to the right of the group. Through her little peephole, Sophie saw the flesh-lump-eating giant moving over to intercept them. He didn't hurry. He just loped over casually to a point where the BFG would have to pass. The others loped after him. Sophie counted 9 of them altogether, and she recognized the blood bottler in the middle of them.
"Hello there, runty one," boomed the flesh-lump-eater. "Where is you, Splatch, winkling away to in such a hefty hurry?"
He shot out an enormous arm and grabbed the BFG by the hair.
"Be so kind as to be letting go of my hair, flesh-lump-eater."
The flesh-lump-eater released him.
"Now then, you little grub-squiffler," boomed the flesh-lump-eater. "We is all of us want to know where you is galloping off to every day in the daytime. The human beings could easily be spotting you and starting a giant hunt."
"I is not galloping to any human being country. I is going to other places."
"I is thinking," said the flesh-lump-eater, "that you is catching human beings and keeping them as pets." "Right you is," cried the blood bottler. "Just now I is hearing him chittering away to one of them in his cave."
"Why, you is welcome to go and search my cave, from frack to bunt." Sophie crouched, still as a mouse inside the BFG's pocket. Suddenly, the flesh-lump-eater shot out 2 enormous hands and grabbed the BFG round the waist. He tossed him high in the air and shouted,
"Catch him, man-hugger!"
The man-hugger caught him. The other giants spread out quickly in a large circle, each about 20 yards from his neighbour, preparing for the game they were going to play. Now the man-hugger threw the BFG high and far, shouting,
"Catch him, bone cruncher!"
And so it went on. The giants were playing ball with the BFG, vying with each other to see who could throw him the highest. Sophie dug her nails into the sides of the pocket, trying to prevent herself from tumbling out when she was upside down. In the end, they got bored with this game. They dumped the poor BFG on the ground. They gave him a few kicks and shouted, "Run, you little runt!" The BFG ran. What else could he do? At last he got clear of them all, and in another couple of minutes the pack of giants was out of sight over the horizon. Sophie popped her head up from the pocket. "I didn't like that," she said.
"Phew," said the BFG. "I is sorry. You was having such a whirly-gig time."
"No worse than you," Sophie said. "How do they actually catch the humans they eat?" Sophie asked.
"Oh, they is usually just sticking an arm through the bedroom window and snitching them from their beds."
"Like you did to me."
"Ah, but I isn't eating you. Sometimes they's swimmelling in from the sea like fishes with only their head showing above the water, and then out comes a big hairy hand and grabbles someone off the beach."
"What, children as well?"
"Often chidlers," the BFG said. "Little chidlers is not so tough to eat as old grandmamma."
As they talked, the BFG was galloping fast over the land. "But if all these people are disappearing, surely there's some sort of outcry," Sophie said.
"Well, the world is a whopping big place," the BFG said. "The giants is clever. They's careful not to be skedaddling off to the same country too often. Don't forget that human beings is disappearing everywhere all the time, even without the giants is guzzling them out. Human beings is killing each other much quicker than the giants is doing it."
"But they don't eat each other," Sophie said.
"I is not understanding human beings at all," the BFG said. "You is a human being, and you is saying it is grizzling and horrygust for giants to be eating human beings, right or left?"
"Right," Sophie said.
"But human beings is squishing each other all the time."
He was right, and Sophie knew it. "Even so," she said, defending her own race, "I think it's rotten that those foul giants should go off every night to eat humans. Humans have never done them any harm."
"That is what the little piggy wiggy is saying every day. He is saying, I has never done any harm to the human being, so why should he be eating me?"
"Oh dear," Sophie said. "But you don't like it that those beastly giants are eating human every night, do you?"
"I do not," the BFG answered firmly. "One right is not making two lefts."
Suddenly the BFG went into that magical top gear of his. His speed was unbelievable. The landscape became blurred, and again Sophie had to duck down. But this time the BFG didn't stay in top gear long. It seemed as though he'd had some barrier to cross, a vast mountain perhaps, or an ocean, or a great desert. But having crossed it, he once again slowed down, and Sophie was able to pop her head up and look out once more at the view. The land was flat and treeless. Every minute the mist became thicker and the air became colder. There was some sort of grass underfoot, but it wasn't green, it was ashy grey. There was no sign of a living creature, and no sound at all except for the soft thud of the BFG's footsteps as he hurtled on. Suddenly he stopped. He bent down and lifted Sophie from his pocket and put her on the ground. "Where are we?"
"We is in dream country. This is where all dreams is beginning."
The big friendly giant put the suitcase on the ground. He bent down low.
"From now on, we is keeping as still as winky little mices," he whispered.
Sophie nodded. The BFG opened the suitcase and took out several empty glass jars. He set them ready on the ground, with their screw tops removed. Then he stood up very straight. He was holding the long net in his right hand. Suddenly the BFG pounced. He leapt high in the air and swung the net through the mist with a great swishing sweep of his arm. "Got him! A jar! Quick, quick, quick! Sophie picked up a jar and held it up to him. He grabbed hold of it. He lowered the net. Very carefully, he tipped something absolutely invisible from the net into the jar. He dropped the net and swiftly clapped one hand over the jar. "The top!" he whispered. "The jar top, quick!" Sophie picked up the screw top and handed it to him. He screwed it on tight, and the jar was closed. "It's a wink squiffler," he whispered with a thrill in his voice. It's even better. It's a golden fizz wizard. Oh, my, oh, my." He handed the jar to Sophie and said, "Please, be still as a starfish now. I was thinking there may be a whole swarm of fizz wizards up here today." Once again the BFG stood up tall in the mist. Then came the long silence. At last, with surprising suddenness, came the leap and the swish of the net. "Another jar! Quick, quick, quick!" When the second dream was safely in the jar and the top was screwed down, the BFG held it to his ear. "Oh, no! Oh, swipe my swoggles!" "What's the matter?" "It's a troggle humper!" he shouted. His voice was filled with fury and anguish. "Oh, save our solos, this is a bad, bad dream. It is a nightmare. Oh, I is never letting it go. If I do, then some poor little toddler will be having the most curd-bloodlin' time. I is exploding it as soon as I get home." Sophie suddenly cried out, "I can see it! There's something in there!" "Well, of course there's something in there," the BFG said. "But you told me dreams were invisible." "They is always invisible until they is captured. After that, they is losing a little of their invisibility." Inside the jar, Sophie could see the faint scarlet outline of something that looked like a mixture between a blob of gas and a bubble of jelly. "It's wiggling all over the place," Sophie cried. "It'll bash itself to bits." "Well, the nastier the dream, the angrier it's getting when it is in prison." The BFG started putting the bottles back into the suitcase. "Is that all?" Sophie asked. "Are we going?" "I is so upset by this truggle-humping, bog-thumping grub switcher that I's not wishing to go on. Dream-catching is finished for today." Soon Sophie was back in the waistcoat pocket, and the BFG was racing home as fast as he could go. When at last they came again onto the hot, yellow wasteland, all the other giants were sprawled out on the ground, fast asleep. "They is always having 50 winks before they go scumpering off to hunt human beings in the evening," the BFG said. "Giants is only sleeping every then and now, not nearly as much as human beings. Human beings is crazy for sleeping." Suddenly, the BFG gave a jump in the air. "By gum frog, I is just having the most whopsy-whiffling idea." "What?" He galloped off, fast to his cave, with Sophie hanging on tight to the rim of the pocket. He rolled back the stone. He entered the cave. He was very excited. "You stay where you is in my pocket, Huggy Bee. We is doing this lovely bit of buck-swashling both together." He laid aside the dream-catching net, but hung on to the suitcase. He ran across to the other side of the cave and grabbed the long trumpet thing. With the suitcase in one hand and the trumpet in the other, he dashed out of the cave. "Peep your head up, good," the BFG said. "Then you will get a fine winkle of what is going on." When the BFG came near to the sleeping giants, he slowed his pace. He crept on his toes towards the ugly brutes. They were still snoring loudly. The BFG tiptoed around them. He went past the gizzard gulper, the blood bottler, the meat dripper, the child chewer. Then he stopped. He had reached the flesh lump eater. He pointed at him. Then he looked down at Sophie and gave her a big wink. He knelt on the ground and very quietly he opened the suitcase. He took out of it the glass jar containing the terrible, nightmarish troggle-humper. At that point, Sophie guessed what was going to happen next. They were about 10 feet away from the flesh-lump-eater's face. The snoring, snorting noise he was making was disgusting. Taking infinite care, the BFG unscrewed the top of the glass jar and tipped the squiggling, squirming, faintly scarlet troggle-humper into the wide end of his long trumpet. He put the other end of the trumpet to his lips. He aimed the instrument directly at the flesh-lump-eater's face. He took a deep breath, puffed out his cheeks, and then whoosh, he blew. Sophie saw a flash of pale red go darting towards the giant's face. For a split second it hovered above the face, then it was gone. It seemed to have been sucked up the giant's nose, but it all happened so quickly, Sophie couldn't be sure. "We had better be skiddling away quick to where it is safe," the BFG whispered. He trotted off for about 100 yards, then he stopped. He crouched low to the earth. "Now," he said, "we is waiting for the gun and flames to begin." They didn't have to wait long. The air was suddenly pierced by the most fearful roar Sophie had ever heard, and she saw the flesh-lump-eater's body, all 54 feet of it, rise up off the ground and fall back again with a thump. Then it began to wriggle and twist and bounce about in the most violent fashion. It was quite frightening to watch. "Yeah!" roared the flesh-lump-eater. "Ah!" "He's still asleep," the BFG whispered. "The terrible troggle-humping nightmare is beginning to hit him." "Save us!" screamed the flesh-lump-eater. "He's after me!" The thrashing of limbs and the waving of arms became more violent by the second. "It's Jack!" bellowed the flesh-lump-eater. "Jack is after me! Oh, spare me, Jack!" "Who is this Jack he's on about?" Sophie whispered. "Well, Jack is the only human being all giants is frightened of," the BFG told her. "They is all hearing that Jack is a famous giant killer." "Save me!" screamed the flesh-lump-eater. "Have mercy on this poor little giant! The beanstalk! He's coming at me with his terrible spike-sticking beanstalk!" "Us giants," the BFG whispered, "is not knowing very much about this dreaded human being called Jack. We is knowing only that he's a famous giant killer and that he is owning something called a beanstalk." Sophie couldn't stop smiling. "What is you griggling at?" the BFG asked her, slightly nettled. "I'll tell you later," Sophie said. The awful nightmare had now gripped the great brute to such an extent that he was tying his whole body into knots. "Do not do it, Jack! I swear I has never gobbled a single human being in all my wholesome life." "Liar," said the BFG. Just then, one of the flesh-lump-eater's flailing fists caught the still fast asleep, meat-dripping giant smack in the mouth. At the same time, one of his furiously thrashing legs kicked the snoring, gizzard-gulping giant right in the guts. Both the injured giants woke up and leapt to their feet. "He is swiping me right in the mouth," yelled the meat-dripper. "He's bung-swaggling me smack in the guts," shouted the gizzard-gulper. The two of them rushed at the flesh-lump-eater and began pounding him with their fists and feet. The wretched flesh-lump-eater woke up with a bang. He awoke straight from one nightmare into another. He roared into battle, and in the bellowing, thumping rough and tumble that followed, one sleeping giant after another got stepped upon or kicked. Soon all 9 of them were on their feet, having the most almighty free-for-all. Blood flowed, noses went crunch, the giants roared and screamed and cursed. The BFG smiled a big, wide smile of absolute pleasure. "I is loving it when they is all having a good toughened rumble." "They'll kill each other," Sophie said. "Never. Those beasts is always bishing and walloping at one another. Soon it'll be getting dusk, and they'll be galloping off to fill their tummies." And the BFG headed back to the cave. The big friendly giant was seated at the great table in his cave, and he was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the tabletop nearby, watching him at work. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream they'd caught that day stood between them. The BFG, with great care and patience, was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. "What are you writing?" Sophie asked him.
"Oh, every dream is having its special label on the bottle. How else could I be finding the one I am wanting in a hurry?"
"But can you really and truly tell what sort of dream it's going to be, simply by listening to it?"
I can."
"But how? Is it by the way it hums and buzzes?"
"Why, you is more or less right," the BFG said. "Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy hum music."
"Do you mean tunes?"
"I is not meaning tunes."
"Then what do you mean?"
"Human beings is having their own music, right or left."
"Right. Lots of music."
"And sometimes human beings is very overcome when they is hearing wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles, right or left."
"Right."
"So, the music is sending a message. I don't think the human beings is knowing what that message is, but they is loving it just the same."
"Yeah, that's about right," Sophie said.
"But because of these jump-squiffling ears of mine, I is not only able to hear the music that dreams is making, but I is understanding it also. I can read it. It's like a language."
"I find that just a little hard to believe," Sophie said. The BFG regarded Sophie gravely, with those huge eyes of his.
"The matter with human beings is that they is absolutely refusing to believe in anything unless they is actually seeing it right in front of their own schnozzles."
He turned away contemptuously from Sophie and resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read what he had written so far. Here is what it said.
"This dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is diving into the river from a high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank, and then I is giving him the kiss of death."
"The kiss of what?" Sophie asked.
The BFG stopped writing and raised his head slowly. "I is telling you once before," he said quietly, "that I is never having a chance to go to school. I do my best. You is a lovely little girl, but please remember that you is not exactly Miss Know-Everything yourself."
"I'm sorry. I really am. It's very rude of me to keep correcting you."
The BFG gazed at her for a while longer. Then he bent his head again to his slow, laborious writing.
"Tell me honestly, if you blew this dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really and truly start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning by diving off the bridge?"
"More. A lot more. But I cannot be scribbling the whole grope-flunking dream on a titchy bit of paper."
The BFG laid down his pencil and placed one massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently.
"Yes," he said, "this dream is continuing very nice."
"How does it end?" Sophie said. "Please, tell me."
"You would be dreaming," the BFG said, "that the morning after you is saving the teacher from the river, you is arriving at school, and you is seeing all the 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall, and all the teachers as well, and the head teacher is standing up and saying, 'I is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie, because she is so brave and is saving the life of our fine arithmetic teacher, Mr. Figgins, so 3 cheers for Sophie.' And the whole school is then cheering like mad and shouting, 'Bravo, well done.' And forever after that, even when you is getting all your sums all gung-swizzled and muggled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing, 'Good work, Sophie,' in your exercise book. Then you was waking up.
I like that dream.
Of course you like it, the BFG said. It's a fizz wizard.
He licked the back of the label and stuck it on the jar.
I is usually writing a bit more than this on the labels, but you is watching me and making me jumpsy.
I'll go and sit somewhere else, Sophie said.
Well, don't go. Look in the jar carefully, and I think you will be seeing this dream.
Sophie peered into the jar, and there, sure enough, she saw the faint, translucent outline of something about the size of a hen's egg. There it lay, this small, oblong, sea-green, jellyish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peaceful, but pulsing gently. "It's moving," Sophie cried. "It's alive!"
"Of course it's alive."
"What will you feed it on?"
"It isn't needing any food."
"Well, that's cruel. Everything alive needs food of some sort, even trees and plants."
"North Wind is alive," the BFG said. "It is moving, touches you on the cheek and on the hands, but nobody is feeding it."
Sophie was silent. This extraordinary giant was disturbing her ideas.
A dream is not needing anything. If it's a good one, it is waiting peaceably for ever until it is released and allowed to do its job. If it's a bad one, it's always fighting to get out.
The BFG stood up and walked over to one of the many shelves and placed the latest jar among the thousands of others. "Please, can I see some of the other dreams?" Sophie asked him.
The BFG hesitated. Nobody's ever seen them before. But perhaps, after all, I is letting you have a little peep."
He picked her up off the table and carried her towards the shelves.
"Over here is some of the good dreams, the fizz wizards."
"Would you hold me closer so I can read the labels?"
"Well, my labels is only telling bits of it. The dreams is actually much longer."
Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her. This is what it said.
"Today I is sitting in class and I discover that if I is staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her, and in the end her head drops onto her desk and she goes fast to sleep and snorkles loudly. Then in marches the head teacher, and he shouts, 'Wake up, Miss Plumridge! How dare you go to sleep in my class? Go fetch your hat and coat and leave this school forever. You is sacked!' But in a jiffy, I is putting the head teacher to sleep as well, and he just crumples slowly to the floor like a lump of jelly, and there he lies all in a heap, and starts snorkling even louder than Miss Plumridge. And then I is hearing my mummy's voice saying, 'Wake up, your breakfast is ready.'"
"What a funny dream," Sophie said.
"It's a ring bella," the BFG said. "It's a whopsy."
"Do you have separate dreams for boys and for girls?"
"Of course," the BFG said. "If I is giving a girl's dream to a boy, even if it was a real whopsy girl's dream, the boy would be waking up and thinking, 'What a rot, bungling, grink-sludging old dream that was.' Oh, these here is all girls' dreams on this shelf."
"Can I read a boy's dream?"
"You can," the BFG said,
and he lifted her to a higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar read as follows:
"I is making myself a marvellous pair of suction boots, and when I put them on I is able to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, I is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she is starting to yell at me, as she always does, yelling, 'What on earth is you doing up there walking on the ceiling?' And I looks down at her, and I smiles, and I says, 'I told you you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it.'"
"Boys are crazy," Sophie said.
"Dreams
is very mystical things, the BFG said. Human beings is not understanding them at all. Not even their brainiest Persephas is understanding them. Well, that's enough for now. There is dillions more, but my arm's getting tired holding you up.
What are all those over there? Why have they got such tiny labels?
Well, that is, of course, one day I is catching so many dreams I is not having the time or energy to write out long labels, but there's enough to remind me.
Can I look? Sophie said.
The long-suffering BFG carried her across to the jars she was pointing to. Sophie read them rapidly, one after the other. I is climbing Mount Everest with just my pussycat for company. I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste. I is able to make the electric lights go on and off just by wishing it. I is only an 8-year-old boy, but I's grown a splendid bushy beard, and all the other boys is jealous.
What amazes me, Sophie said, is how you ever learnt to write in the first place.
Ah, I had been wondering how long it is before you was asking me that.
Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvellous. How did you learn?
The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a book, very old and tattered. By human standards, it was an ordinary-sized book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his huge hand. One night, I was blowing a dream through a window, and I sees this book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it so very badly, you understand? But I was refusing to steal it. I would never do that.
So, how did you get it?
Sophie asked. I borrowed it, the BFG said, smiling a little. Just for a short time I borrowed it.
Well, how long have you had it?
Perhaps only about 80 years, the BFG said. Soon I shall be putting it back.
And that's how you taught yourself to write? Sophie asked him.
I is reading it hundreds of times, and I is still reading it, and teaching new words to myself, and how to write them. It's the most scrum-diddly-umptious story. Sophie took the book out of his hand.
Nicholas Nickleby, she read aloud.
By Dahl's chickens.
By who?
Just then there came a tremendous noise of galloping feet from outside the cave.
What's that?
Sophie cried. That is all the giants, zip-fizzing off to another country to guzzle human beans, the BFG said. He quickly popped Sophie into his waistcoat pocket, then hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie, peeping out of her spy-hole, saw all 9 of the fearsome giants coming past at full gallop. "Where's you off to tonight?" shouted the BFG. "We's all of us flash-bunking off to England tonight," answered the flesh-lamp-eater as they went galloping past. "England is a lactuous land, and we is fancying a few nice little English chidlers." "I," shouted the maid-masher, "is knowing where there is a giggle house for girls, and I is guzzling myself full as a froth-blower. "And I knows where there's a boggle box for boys," shouted the gizzard gulper. "All I has to do is reach in and grab myself a handful. English boys is tasting extra lick swishy." In a few seconds, the 9 galloping giants were out of sight.
"What did he mean?" Sophie said, poking her head out of the pocket. "What is a giggle house for girls?"
"He is meaning a girls' school. He'll be eating them by the bundle."
"Oh, no,"
cried Sophie. "And boys from a boys' school."
"It mustn't happen,"
Sophie cried out.
"We've got to stop them."
"There's not a thing we can do. We is helpless as horse feathers."
The
BFG sat down on a large, craggy blue rock near the entrance to his cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and put her beside him on the rock.
"It's now quite safe for you to be outside."
The sun had dipped below the horizon and it was getting dark. "We've absolutely got to stop them," Sophie cried. "Put me back in your pocket, quick, and we'll chase after them and warn everyone in England they're coming."
"Redunculous and, possible. They is going 2 times as fast as me, and they is finishing their guzzle before we is halfway."
"But we can't just sit here doing nothing. How many girls and boys are they going to eat tonight?"
"Many," the BFG said. "But there's nothing I can do. If I wasn't a titchy little runty giant, only about 24 feet high, then I would be stopping them. But that is absolutely out of the window."
"Do you always know where they're going?"
"Always. Every night they is yelling at me as they go bootling past."
"I can't stand it. We've got to go after those brutes."
"No."
"We must. Oh, why won't you go?" The BFG sighed and shook his head firmly.
"I has told you 5 or 6 times, and the 3rd will be the last. I is never showing myself to human beings."
"Why ever not?"
"If I do, they will be putting me in the zoo with all the jiggy rafts and caterpillars."
"Nonsense," Sophie said.
"And they will be sending you straight back to an orphanage. Grown-up human beings is not famous for their kindnesses."
"That simply isn't true. Some of them are very kind indeed."
"Who? Name one."
"The Queen of England," Sophie said.
"The flesh-lump eater is longing dearly to guzzle her up," the BFG said, smiling a little now.
"Who? The Queen?" Sophie cried, aghast.
"Yes. Flesh-lump eater says he's never eaten a queen, and he thinks perhaps she has an especially scrum-diddly-umptious flavour."
"How dare he?" Sophie was silent for a few moments. Then, suddenly, in a voice filled with excitement, she cried out, "I've got it! By golly, I think I've got it!"
"Got what?"
"The answer. We'll go to the Queen. It's a terrific idea. If I went and told the Queen about these disgusting man-eating giants, I'm sure she'd do something about it." The BFG looked down at her sadly and shook his head.
"She is never believing you."
"I think she would."
"Never. I has told you before that human beings is simply not believing in giants."
"Then it's up to us to find a way of making her believe in them."
"And how is you getting in to see the Queen?"
"Now, hold on a sec. I've got another idea."
"Your ideas is full of crodswoggle."
"Not this one," Sophie said. "You say that if we tell the Queen, she would never believe us?"
"Are you certain she wouldn't?"
"But we aren't going to tell her," Sophie said excitedly. "We don't have to tell her. We'll make her dream it."
"Well, that is an even more froth-bungling suggestion," the BFG said. "Dreams is lots of fun, but nobody is believing in dreams either."
"Don't you worry about that part of it. I can fix that."
"Never can you fix it."
"I can. I swear I can. But first of all, let me ask you a very important question. Can you make a person dream absolutely anything in the world?"
"Anything you like,"
the BFG said proudly. "If I said I wanted to dream that I was in a flying bathtub with silver wings, could you make me dream it?"
"I could."
"But how?" Sophie said. "You obviously don't have exactly that dream in your collection."
"I do not," the BFG said, "but I could soon be mixing it up."
"How could you mix it up?"
"It's a little bit like mixing a cake. If you was putting the right amounts of all the different things into it, you was making the cake come out any way you want. Sugary, spongy, curranty, Christmassy, or grub-switchy. Well, it's the same with dreams. I has dreams about bathtubs, lots of them. I has dreams about silver wings. I has dreams about flying. So all I has to do is mix those dreams together in the proper way, and I is very quickly making a dream where you is flying in a bathtub with silver wings."
I see what you mean. But I didn't know you could mix one dream with another.
Dreams like being mixed.
Right, said Sophie. Now then, do you have dreams about the Queen of England?
Lots of them.
And about giants?
Of course.
And about giants eating people?
Swiggles of them.
And about little girls like me?
Oh, those is the commonest of all. I has bottles and bottles of dreams about little girls.
And you could mix them all up, just as I want you to? Sophie asked, getting more and more excited.
Of course. But how is this helping us? I think you was barking up the wrong dog.
Now, hold on, Sophie said. Listen carefully. I want you to mix a dream which you will blow into the Queen of England's bedroom when she is asleep. And this is how it'll go.
Now, hang on a minute. How is I possibly going to get near enough to the Queen of England's bedroom to blow in my dream?
I'll tell you that later, Sophie said. For the moment, please listen carefully. Here is the dream I want you to mix. I want the Queen to dream that 9 disgusting giants, each one about 50 feet tall, are galloping to England in the night. She must dream their names as well. What are their names again?
Flesh lump eater, man hugger, bone cruncher, child chewer, meat dripper, gizzard gulper, maid masher, blood bottler, and the butcher boy.
Well, let her dream all those names, Sophie said, and let her dream that they will be creeping into England in the depths of the witching hour and snatching little boys and girls from their beds. And then the dream must say that when their tummies are full, they will be galloping back to giant country where no one can find them.
Well, is that all?
Certainly not, Sophie said. You must then explain to the Queen in her dream that there is a big friendly giant who can tell her where all those beasts are living, so that she can send her soldiers and her armies to capture them once and for all. And now let her dream one last and very important thing. Let her dream that there is a little girl called Sophie sitting on her windowsill who will tell her where the big friendly giant is hiding.
Well, where is he hiding?
We'll come to that later. So the Queen dreams her dream, right?
Right, the BFG said.
Then she wakes up, and the first thing she thinks is, oh, what a horrid dream. I'm so glad it was only a dream. And then she looks up from her pillow, and what does she see?
What does she see?
She sees a little girl called Sophie sitting on her windowsill, right there in real life before her very eyes.
How is you going to be sitting on the Queen's windowsill, may I beg?
You are going to put me there. And that's the lovely part about it. If someone dreams that there is a little girl sitting on her windowsill, and then she wakes up and sees that the little girl really is sitting there, that is a dream come true, isn't it?
I is beginning to see what you is driving to. If the Queen is knowing that part of her dream is true, then perhaps she is believing the rest of it is true as well.
That's about it, Sophie said.
You said you is wanting the dream to say there is a big, friendly giant who is also going to talk to the Queen?
Absolutely, you must. You are the only one who can tell her where to find the other giants.
How is I meeting the Queen? Asked the BFG. I's not wanting to be shooted at by her soldiers.
The soldiers are only in the front of the palace, Sophie said. At the back there's a huge garden and there are no soldiers in there at all. There's a very high wall with spikes on it around the garden to stop people climbing in. But you could simply walk over that.
How is you knowing all about this Queen's palace? The BFG asked.
Well, last year I was in a different orphanage. It was in London, and we used to go for walks all around there.
I is frightened of London.
Don't be, Sophie said. It's full of tiny, dark streets, and there are very few people about in the witching hour.
The BFG picked Sophie up between one finger and a thumb and placed her gently in the palm of the other hand.
Is the Queen's palace very big?
Huge, Sophie said.
Then how is we finding the right bedroom?
That's up to you, Sophie said. You're supposed to be an expert at that sort of thing.
And you is absolutely sure the Queen will not put me in a zoo with all the catty piddlers?
Of course she won't, Sophie said. You'll be a hero, and you'll never have to eat snos-cumbers again. Sophie saw the BFG's eyes widen. He licked his lips.
You mean it? You really mean it? No more disgustive snos-cumbers?
You couldn't get one if you wanted to, Sophie said. Humans don't grow them. That did it. The BFG got to his feet.
When is you want me to mix this special dream?
Now, Sophie said. At once.
When is we going to see the Queen?
Tonight. As soon as you've mixed the dream.
Why such a flush-bunkin' flurry?
Well, if we can't save tonight's children, we can anyway save tomorrow's.
Then we'd better get crackling, the BFG said,
moving back towards the cave. Sophie kissed him on the tip of his thumb. I knew you'd do it. It was dark now. The BFG hurried into the cave and put on those brilliant blinding lights that seemed to come from nowhere. He placed Sophie on the table.
Stay there, please, he said, and no chittering.
He hurried away from her. He got out an enormous empty glass jar. He clutched it to his chest and hurried towards the shelves on which stood the thousands and thousands of smaller jars containing the captured dreams.
Dreams about giants, he muttered to himself as he searched the labels. Here's one, and here's another.
He grabbed the jars and unscrewed the tops. He tipped the dreams into the enormous jar. Then he hurried towards another shelf.
Now I was wanting dreams about giggle houses for girls, and about boggle boxes for boys, and dreams about a little girl, and dreams about me.
And so it went on. In about half an hour the BFG had found all the dreams he wanted, and tipped them into the one huge jar. He put the jar on the table.
Now we is mixing them.
The BFG went to the cupboard where he kept his bottles of Frobscottle, and from it he took out a gigantic egg beater. It was one of those that has a handle which you turn, and down below there are a lot of overlapping blades that go whizzing round. He inserted the bottom end of this contraption into the big jar where the dreams were lying.
"Watch," he said.
He started turning the handle very fast. Flashes of green and blue exploded inside the jar. The dreams were being whisked into a sea-green froth. The poor things!
Oh, they is not feeling it. Dreams is not like human beings or animals. They has no brains. They is made of zosimus.
After about a minute, the BFG stopped whisking. The whole bottle was now full to the brim with large bubbles.
"Keep watching," said the BFG.
Quite slowly, the topmost bubble rose up through the neck of the jar and floated away. A second one followed, then a third and a fourth. Soon the cave was filled with hundreds of beautifully coloured bubbles, all drifting gently through the air. It was truly a wonderful sight. As Sophie watched them, they all started floating towards the cave entrance, which was still open. "They're going out," Sophie whispered.
"Of course," the
BFG said. "Where to?"
"Those is all little tiny dream bits that I isn't using. They's going back to the misty country to join up with proper dreams. Look in the big bottle, and you will now see the dream you is wanting for the Queen."
Sophie turned and stared into the great jar. On the bottom of it was something thrashing around wildly, bouncing up and down and flinging itself against the walls of the jar. Good heavens! Is that it?
"That's it," the BFG said proudly.
"But it's horrible. It's jumping about. It wants to get out."
"That's because it's a troggle-humper. It's a nightmare."
"Oh, but I don't want you to give the Queen a nightmare."
"If she is dreaming about giants guzzling up little boys and girls, then what is you expecting it to be except a nightmare?"
"Oh, no."
"Oh, yes," the BFG said.
Sophie stared down at the fearful nightmare dream that was still thrashing away in the huge glass jar. I don't want to give the Queen a nightmare.
I is thinking that your Queen'll be happy to have a nightmare, if having a nightmare is going to save a lot of human beings from being gobbled up by filthsome giants. Is I right or is I left?
I suppose you're right.
She'll soon be getting over it.
Have you put all the other important things into it? Sophie asked.
When I is blowing that dream into the Queen's bedroom, she will be dreaming every single little thing-a-ling-a-ling you is asking me to make her a dream.
As he spoke, the BFG picked up one of his smaller jars and very quickly tipped the struggling, thrashing Troggle-humper out of the large jar into the small one. Then he screwed the lid tightly onto the small jar.
That's it. We is now ready.
The BFG put on his great black cloak. He tucked the jar into a pocket in his cloak. He picked up his long trumpet-like dream blower. Then he turned and looked at Sophie, who was still on the tabletop.
The dream bottle is in my pocket. Is you going to sit there with it during the travel?
Never, cried Sophie. I refuse to sit next to that beastly thing.
And where is you going to sit?
Sophie looked him over for a few moments. If you would be kind enough to swivel one of your lovely big ears so that it is lying flat like a dish, that would make a very cosy place for me to sit.
By gumbo, that is a squackling good idea, the BFG said.
Slowly, he swivelled his huge right ear until it was like a great shell facing the heavens. He lifted Sophie up and placed her into it. I hope I don't fall down your ear hole, Sophie said.
Be very careful not to do that. You would be giving me a cronking earache.
The nice thing about being there was that she could whisper directly into his ear.
You is tickling me a bit, the BFG said. Please don't jiggle about.
I'll try not to. Are we ready?
Ow! Yelled the BFG. Don't do that.
I didn't do anything.
You is talking too loud. You is forgetting that I is hearing every little thing-a-ling-a-ling 50 times louder than usual, and there you is shouting away right inside my ear.
Oh, gosh, is that better? Sophie whispered.
No, cried the BFG. It sounds as though you is shooting off a blunderbuss.
Then how can I talk to you? Sophie whispered.
Don't.
Sophie tried speaking right under her breath. Is this better? She spoke so softly, she couldn't even hear her own voice.
That's better, the BFG said. Now I is hearing you very nicely. What is it you is trying to say to me just now?
I was saying, are we ready?
We is off, cried the BFG.
The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight, as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie hadn't slept for a long time. She was very warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now, with mountains and forests. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow his pace.
We is in England now, he said suddenly.
Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields, with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange-coloured glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them.
We is coming close to London, the BFG said.
He slowed to a trot. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there were still no lights in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet. Someone's bound to see us, Sophie said.
Never is they seeing me, the BFG said confidently. You is forgetting that I's doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me.
I did, Sophie whispered.
Ah, yes, but you was the very first.
During the next half-hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in streets, there were houses everywhere. There were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on, but nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. He seemed to melt into the shadows. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from his cave many hours before.
"What's the matter?"
Sophie whispered in her under-the-breath voice.
"I is in a bit of a puddle." "You're doing marvellously,"
Sophie whispered.
"No, I isn't. I is now completely boggled. I is lost."
"But why?"
"Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in green pastures."
"Don't be silly,"
Sophie whispered.
"This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are."
"You is joking."
"I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" "It's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "This is where I take over."
"Which way?"
the BFG asked. "Straight ahead."
The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park.
"Now stop."
The BFG stopped.
"You see that huge roundabout ahead of us, just outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "I see it. That is Hyde Park Corner."
Even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered,
"In the middle of the roundabout there is an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and rider on top of it. Can you see that?"
The BFG peered through the trees.
"I is seeing it," he said. "Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, you could jump clear over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch and over the horse and rider, and land on the pavement the other side?"
"Easy,"
the BFG said. "Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner."
"Don't get so flushed. To me that's a snitchy little jump."
"Then go," Sophie whispered.
The BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap.
"Well done," Sophie whispered. "Now quick, over that wall."
Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it.
"We're there," Sophie whispered excitedly. "We're in the Queen's back garden."
"By gumdrops," whispered the big friendly giant.
"Is this really it?" "There's the palace," Sophie whispered back.
Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and the tidy flower beds, the massive shape of the palace itself loomed through the darkness.
"But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least." "Easily, I should think," Sophie whispered.
"Then I is boggled," the BFG said. "How is I possibly finding the one where the Queen is sleeping?"
"Let's go a bit closer and have a look," Sophie whispered.
The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to swivel round.
"Hey!"
Sophie whispered.
"You're going to tip me out."
"Shh!" the BFG whispered back.
"I is hearing something."
He stopped behind a clump of bushes, the ear swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man paddling softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness.
"You was telling me they has no soldiers in the back garden," the BFG whispered.
"He wasn't a soldier," Sophie replied. "He was some sort of watchman. We'll have to be careful."
"Oh, I isn't too worried. These waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the noise of a man breathing the other side of this garden."
"How much longer before it begins to get light?" Sophie whispered.
"Very short. We must go pell-mell for leather now."
He glided forward through the vast garden, and suddenly they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows 1 flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting on, close to the first window.
"No," he whispered.
"What are you listening for?"
Sophie whispered back. "For breathing. I is able to tell if it is a man human being or a lady by the breathing voice we has a man in there."
The BFG glided on, flattening his tall, thin, black-coated body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. He listened.
"No," he whispered.
He moved on.
"This room is empty," he whispered.
He listened in at several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window in the very centre of the palace, he listened, but did not move on.
Oh, we has a lady sleeping in there."
The BFG reached up through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at a face she had seen on stamps and coins and in newspapers all her life. For a few seconds she was speechless.
"Is that her?"
the BFG whispered.
"Yes,"
Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he pushed up the lower half of the window as far as it would go so as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge, with her legs dangling just inside the room but behind the curtains. It was summer-time in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was wearing only her thin nightie. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightie from watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains far into the room, aiming at the place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath. He puffed out his cheeks, and poof! He blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very, very carefully like a thermometer.
"Is you all right, sitting there?" he whispered.
"Yes," Sophie murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it.
"How long will the dream take to work?" Sophie whispered. "Some takes an hour. Some is quicker, some is slower still. But it's sure to find her in the end."
Sophie said nothing.
"I is going off to wait in the garden. When you is wanting me, just call out my name, and I is coming very quick."
"Will you hear me?"
Sophie whispered. "You is forgetting these," the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great ears.
"Goodbye," Sophie whispered. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. Side 3. Dawn came at last, and the rim of a lemon-coloured sun rose up behind the rooftop, somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little of its warmth on her back and was grateful. In the distance, she heard a church clock striking. She counted the strikes. There were 7. She found it almost impossible to believe that she, Sophie, a little orphan of no real importance in the world, was at this moment actually sitting high above the ground on the windowsill of the Queen of England's bedroom. No one had ever done such a thing before. What would happen if the dream didn't work? No one, least of all the Queen, would believe a word of her story. How much longer? She wondered. What time do queens wake up? Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then, all at once, beyond the curtains, she heard the voice of the sleeper in the bedroom. It was a slightly blurred sleep-talker's voice. "Oh, no," it cried out. "No, don't. Someone stop them. No, don't let them do it. I can't bear it. Oh, please stop them. It's horrible. Oh, it's ghastly. No, no, no." She is having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be really horrid. I feel so sorry for her, but it has to be done. After that, there were a few moans. Then there was a long silence. Inside the room beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob being turned. She heard someone entering the room. "Good morning, Your Majesty," a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause, and then a slight rattle of china and silver. "Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table?" "Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened." This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. "Whatever is it, ma'am?" "I've just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful." "Oh, I am sorry, ma'am. But don't be distressed. It was only a dream, ma'am." "Do you know what I dreamt, Mary? I dreamt that girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding school and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. It was all so vivid, Mary. It was so real." There was a silence. "Mary, you've gone as white as a sheet. Are you feeling ill?" There was suddenly a crash and a clatter of crockery, which could only have meant that the tray the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. "Mary, you really mustn't take it so hard, just because I've had an awful dream." That isn't the reason, ma'am." The maid's voice was quivering terribly. "Then, for heaven's sake, what is the reason?" "You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am?" "No. What do they say?" Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. "It's like the very dream you had in the night, ma'am." "Rubbish, Mary. Where is it?" "On the front page, ma'am. It's the big headlines." "Oh, great Scott!" cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanish mysteriously from their beds at Roedean School. 14 boys disappear from Eton. Bones are found underneath dormitory windows." Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice, as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested. "Oh, how ghastly!" the famous voice cried out. "It's absolutely frightful. Oh, those poor children." "But, ma'am, don't you see, ma'am—" "See what, Mary?" "Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dreamt it, ma'am." "Not by giants, Mary?" "No, ma'am. But the bit about the girls and boys disappearing from their dormitories, you dreamt it so clearly, and then it actually happened. That's why I came over all queer, ma'am. Well, I'm coming over a bit queer myself, Mary." "I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and have this mess cleared up." "No, don't go, Mary. Stay here a moment. I really did dream about those children, Mary. It was clear as crystal." "I know you did, ma'am. I don't know how giants got into it. That was rubbish." "Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am?
Then we shall all feel better. It's a lovely day. Please do."
With a swish, the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze to the window ledge. The Queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there staring wide-eyed and white-faced at the small girl who was perched on her windowsill in a nightie. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the Queen looked petrified too. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on the top of her head, was the first to recover.
"What in the name of heaven do you think you're doing in here?" she shouted angrily to Sophie.
Sophie looked beseechingly towards the Queen for help. The Queen was still staring at Sophie.
"I don't believe it," the Queen was murmuring. "I'll take her out, ma'am, at once," the maid was saying. "No, Mary, no, don't do that."
The Queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken aback. Are you all right, ma'am?" When the Queen spoke again, it was in a strange, strangled sort of whisper.
"And tell me, Mary, tell me quite truthfully, is there really a little girl sitting on my windowsill? Or am I still dreaming?" "She's sitting there, all right, ma'am, as clear as daylight. Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming it this time." "But that's exactly what I did dream," the Queen cried out. "I dreamt that as well. I dreamt there would be a little girl sitting on my windowsill in her nightie, and she would talk to me."
The maid, with her hands clasped across her starched white bosom, was staring at her mistress.
"Are you real?" the Queen said to Sophie. Yes, Your Majesty," Sophie murmured. "What is your name?" "Sophie, Your Majesty." "And how did you get up on my windowsill? No, don't answer that. I dreamed that part of it too. I dreamed that a giant put you there." "He did, Your Majesty."
The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face.
"Control yourself, Mary," the Queen said sharply. Then to Sophie she said, "You're not serious about the giant, are you?" "Oh, yes, Your Majesty. He's out there, in the garden now."
"Is he indeed?" the Queen said. The sheer absurdity of it all was helping her to regain her composure.
"He is a good giant, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "You needn't be frightened of him. I'm delighted to hear it," said the Queen, still smiling. "He's a lovely giant, Your Majesty. Yeah, I'm quite sure he is. But why have you and this giant come to see me?" "I think you have dreamed that part of it too, Your Majesty," Sophie said calmly.
That pulled the Queen up short. It took the smile right off her face. She certainly had dreamed that part of it. "But be careful," the Queen told herself. "Keep very calm, because this is surely not very far from the place where madness begins."
"You did dream that, didn't you, Your Majesty?"
"Yes," the Queen murmured.
"Yes. Now you come to mention it, I did. But how do you know what I dreamed?" "Oh, that's a long story, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "Would you like me to call the big friendly giant? You'll like him very much." The Queen took a deep breath. "Very well. You may call your giant. No, wait a minute. Mary, pull yourself together. Give me my dressing gown and slippers. You may call him now." Sophie turned her head towards the garden and called out, "BFG? Her Majesty the Queen would like to see you." The Queen crossed over to the window and stood beside Sophie. "Come down off that ledge," she said. "You're going to fall backwards any moment." Sophie jumped down into the room and stood beside the Queen at the open window. Mary, the maid, stood behind them. "I don't see any giant," the Queen said. "Please, wait," Sophie said. "Shall I take her away now, ma'am?" the maid said. "Take her downstairs and give her some breakfast," the Queen said. Just then there was a rustle in the bushes beside the lake. Then out he came. 24 feet tall,
wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand, he strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The maid screamed. The Queen gasped. Sophie waved. The BFG took his time. He was very dignified in his approach. When he was close to the window where the three of them were standing, he stopped and made a slow, graceful bow. His head, after he had straightened up again, was almost exactly level with the watchers at the window.
"Your Magister," he said, "I is your humbug servant."
He bowed again. Considering she was meeting a giant for the first time in her life, the Queen remained astonishingly self-composed. "We are very pleased to meet you," she said.
"Oh, Magister!" cried the BFG. "Oh, Queen! Oh, Monarcher! Oh, ruler of straight lines! Oh, Sultaner! I has come here with my little friend Sophie to give you a—"
The BFG hesitated, searching for the word. "To give me what?" the Queen said.
"A assistance," the BFG said, beaming.
The Queen looked puzzled. "He sometimes speaks a bit funny, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "He never went to school." "No, then we must send him to school," the Queen said. "We have some very good schools in this country."
"I has great secrets to tell your Magister."
"Well, I should be delighted to hear them," the Queen said, "but not in my dressing gown." "Shall you wish to get dressed, ma'am?" the maid said. "Have either of you had breakfast?" the Queen said. "Oh, could we?" Sophie cried. "I haven't eaten a thing since yesterday." "Well, I was about to have mine," the Queen said, "but Mary dropped it." The maid gulped. "I imagine we have more food in the palace," the Queen said, speaking to the BFG. "Perhaps you and your little friend would care to join me." The Queen turned to the maid and said, "Mary, ask them to serve breakfast for 3 in the— I think it had better be in the ballroom. That has the highest ceiling." And to the BFG she said, "I'm afraid you will have to go through the door on your hands and knees. I shall send someone to show you the way." The BFG reached up and lifted Sophie out of the window.
"You and I is leaving Her Magister alone to get dressed," he said.
"No, leave the little girl here with me," the Queen said. "We'll have to find something for her to put on. She can't have breakfast in her nightie." The BFG returned Sophie to the bedroom. "Can we have sausages, Your Majesty?" Sophie said, "and bacon and fried eggs?" "I think that might be managed," the Queen answered, smiling. "Just you wait till you taste it," Sophie said to the BFG. "No more snos-cumbers from now on." There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the Queen that a 24-foot giant must be seated with Her Majesty in the great ballroom within the next half-hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants. In a split second he'd made the following calculations in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot high table to eat off, a 24-foot giant will require a 12-foot high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with a 2-foot high seat, a 24-foot giant will require a chair with an 8-foot high seat. Everything, Mr. Tibbs told himself, must be multiplied by 4. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. "Push the grand piano into the centre of the room," Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raised their voices above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano. "Now, fetch a large chest of drawers and put it on top of the piano," Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. "That'll be his chair," Mr. Tibbs whispered. "Now we shall make a table. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. Let each clock be 12 foot high."
16 footmen spread out around the palace to find the clocks. They weren't easy to carry. "Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle, 8 feet by 4, alongside the grand piano," Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footman did so. "Now, fetch me the young prince's ping-pong table," Mr. Tibbs whispered. The ping-pong table was carried in. "Unscrew its legs and take them away," Mr. Tibbs whispered. This was done. "Now, place the ping-pong table on top of the 4 grandfather clocks," Mr. Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footman had to stand on step-ladders. Mr. Tibbs then gave orders that a damask tablecloth should be draped over the ping-pong table, and in the end it looked really quite elegant after all. At this point, Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. "Knives and forks and spoons," Mr. Tibbs was heard to mutter. "Our cutlery will be like little pins in his hands. Now tell the head gardener that I require immediately a brand-new unused garden fork and also a spade. And for a knife we shall use the great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room. But clean the sword well first. It was last used to cut off the head of King Charles I, and there may still be a little dried blood on the blade." When all this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the centre of the ballroom. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? "Fetch me," he whispered, "the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen." A splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought in and placed on the giant's table. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had the footman move a small, delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and for Sophie. The fact that the giant's table and chair towered far above the smaller table simply couldn't be helped. All these arrangements were only just completed when the Queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom, holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the Queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and had pinned it on the left side of Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing from behind and 2 pulling from the front, but he got through in the end. He had removed his black cloak and got rid of his trumpet, and was now wearing his ordinary, simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he had to stoop quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice an enormous crystal chandelier. Crash! A shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG. "He's never been in a house before," Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs scowled. He directed 4 footmen to clear up the mess. Then, with a disdainful little wave of the hand, he indicated to the giant that he should seat himself on top of the chest of drawers, on top of the grand piano.
"What a fizz-whizzing flush-bunking seat!" cried the BFG.
"Does he always speak like that?" the Queen asked. "Quite often," Sophie said. "He gets tangled up with his words." The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers piano and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom. Footmen arrived, carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realized that in order to serve the BFG at his 12-foot-high grandfather clock table, he would have to climb to the top of one of the tall step-ladders. What's more, he must do it balancing a huge warm plate on the palm of one hand and holding a gigantic silver coffee pot in the other. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs, balancing like an acrobat, poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate, there were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon, and a heap of fried potatoes.
What is this, please, Your Majesty?"
the BFG asked. "He's never eaten anything except snos-cumbers before in his life," Sophie explained. "They taste revolting." "They don't seem to have stunted his growth," the Queen said. The BFG grabbed the garden spade and scooped up all the eggs, sausages, bacon, and potatoes in one go and shovelled them into his enormous mouth.
"Well, by goggles, he cried. "This stuff is making snos-cumbers taste like swatch wallop."
The Queen glanced up, frowning.
"Is you having any more of this delunctious grubble in your cupboard, Magister?"
"Tibbs," the Queen said, showing true regal hospitality, "fetch the gentleman another dozen fried eggs and a dozen sausages." Mr. Tibbs swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself. The BFG lifted the huge jug and took a swallow.
"Ouch!"
he cried, blowing a mouthful across the ballroom.
"Please, what's this horrible swig pill I is drinking, Magister?"
"It's coffee," the Queen told him, "freshly roasted."
"It's filthsome. Where is the Frobscottle?"
"The what?" the Queen asked.
"Delumptious, fizzy Frobscottle," the BFG answered. "Everyone must be drinking Frobscottle with breakfast, Magister. Then we can all be whiz-popping happily together afterwards."
"What does he mean?" the Queen said, frowning at Sophie. "What is whiz-popping?" Sophie kept a very straight face. "BFG, there is no Frobscottle here, and whiz-popping is strictly forbidden."
"What?"
cried the BFG.
"No Frobscottle? No whiz-popping? No glumptious music? No boom-boom-boom?"
"Absolutely not," Sophie told him firmly. If he wants to sing, please don't stop him," the Queen said. "He doesn't want to sing," Sophie said. "He said he wants to make music," the Queen went on. "Shall I send for a violin?" "No, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "He's only joking." A sly smile crossed the BFG's face.
"Listen," he said, peering down at Sophie. "If they isn't having any Frobscottle here in the palace, I can still go whiz-popping perfectly if I is trying hard enough."
"No," cried Sophie. "Don't. I beg you." "Music is very good for the digestion," the Queen said. "When I'm up in Scotland, they play the bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. They do play something."
"I has Her Magister's permission," cried the BFG,
and all at once he let fly with a whiz-popper that sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. The Queen jumped.
"Whoopee!" shouted the BFG. "That is better than baggle pipes, is it not, Magister?"
It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. "I prefer the bagpipes," she said, but she couldn't stop herself smiling. During the next 20 minutes, a whole relay of footmen were kept busy hurrying to and from the kitchen, carrying third helpings and fourth helpings and fifth helpings of fried eggs and sausages for the ravenous and delighted BFG. When the BFG had consumed his 72nd fried egg, Mr. Tibbs sidled up to the Queen. He bent low from the waist and whispered in her ear, "Chef sends his apologies, Your Majesty, and he says he has no more eggs in the kitchen." "What's wrong with the hens?" the Queen said. "Nothing's wrong with the hens, Your Majesty," Mr. Tibbs whispered. "Tell them to lay more," the Queen said. She looked up at the BFG. "Have some toast and marmalade while you're waiting." The toast is finished," Mr. Tibbs whispered, "and Chef says there is no more bread." "Well, tell him to bake more," the Queen said. While all this was going on, Sophie had been telling the Queen everything, absolutely everything, about her visit to the giant country. The Queen listened, appalled. When Sophie had finished, the Queen looked up at the BFG, who was sitting high above her. "A big friendly giant. Last night those man-eating brutes came to England. Can you remember where they went the night before?"
Yes, Magister. They was galloping off to Sweden for the Sweden sour taste."
"Fetch me a telephone," the Queen commanded. Mr. Tibbs placed the instrument on the table. The Queen lifted the receiver. "Get me the King of Sweden." "Good morning. Is everything all right in Sweden?"
"Everything is terrible," the King of Sweden answered. 2 nights ago, 26 of my loyal subjects disappeared."
Your 26 loyal subjects were all eaten by giants, the Queen said. Apparently they like the taste of Swedes. Why do they like the taste of Swedes? The King asked. Because the Swedes of Sweden have a sweet and sour taste. Oh, so says the BFG, the Queen said. I don't know what you're talking about, the King said, growing testy. It's hardly a joking matter when one's loyal subjects are being eaten like popcorn. Well, they've eaten mine as well, the Queen said. Who's they, for heaven's sake? The King asked. Giants, the Queen said. Look here, the King said. Are you feeling all right? Well, it's been a rough morning, the Queen said. First, I had a horrid nightmare. Then the maid dropped my breakfast. And now I've got a giant on the piano. You need a doctor, quick, cried the King. No, I'll be all right, the Queen said. I must go now. Thanks for your help. She replaced the receiver. Your BFG is right, the Queen said to Sophie. Those 9 man-eating brutes did go to Sweden. It's horrible, Sophie said. Please stop them, Your Majesty. I'd like to make one more check before I call out the troops, the Queen said. Think hard, BFG. Where did those horrid giants say they were galloping off to 3 nights ago? The BFG thought long and hard.
Ho, ho, he cried at last. Yes, I is remembering.
Where? Asked the Queen.
Well, one was off to Baghdad. As they is galloping past my cave flesh lump eater is waving his arms and shouting at me, I is off to Baghdad and I's going to Baghdad and Mum and every one of their 10 children as well.
Once more, the Queen lifted the receiver.
Get me the Lord Mayor of Baghdad. If they don't have a Lord Mayor, get me the next best thing.
In 5 seconds, a voice was on the line.
Here is the Sultan of Baghdad speaking. Listen, Sultan, the Queen said, did anything unpleasant happen in your city 3 nights ago? Every night unpleasant things are happening in Baghdad. I want to know if anyone has disappeared recently in Baghdad. Only my uncle, Caliph Harun al-Rashid. He disappeared from his bed 3 nights ago together with his wife and 10 children.
The Queen replaced the receiver.
That proves it, she said, looking up at the BFG. Your story is apparently quite true. Summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force immediately.
The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men.
I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty, the head of the army said. For the last 10 years, we've been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously in the night.
What time is it? The Queen said. 10 a.m. In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. We must act fast.
We'll bomb the blighters, shouted the head of the Air Force. We'll mow them down with machine guns, cried the head of the army.
I don't approve of murder, the Queen said.
But they are murderers themselves, cried the head of the army.
That is no reason why we should follow their example, the Queen said. We must bring them back alive.
How? The 2 military men said together. They're all 50 feet high. Wait, cried the BFG. Hold your horseflies. I think I has the answer. Every afternoon, all these giants is in the land of Noddy. I can't understand a word this fellow says, the head of the army snapped.
He means the land of Nod, Sophie said. It's pretty obvious.
Exactly, cried the BFG. Every afternoon, all these 9 giants is lying on the ground, snoozling away in a very deep sleep. They is always resting like that before they is galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings. So, what you soldiers has to do is to creep up to the giants and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and wonkin' chains.
Brilliant,
the Queen said. That's all very well, said the head of the army. But how do we get the brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants onto trucks. Shoot 'em on the spot, that's what I say.
The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force,
You is having belly poppers, is you not?
Is he being rude? The head of the Air Force said. He means helicopters, Sophie said. Well, of course we have helicopters.
Wopsy big belly poppers?
Asked the BFG. You're very big ones, the head of the Air Force said proudly. But no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like that inside it.
You don't put him inside, the BFG said. You sling him underneath the belly of your belly popper.
Could you do that, Air Marshal? The Queen asked. Well, I suppose we could, the head of the Air Force admitted, grudgingly. Then get cracking, the Queen said. You'll need 9 helicopters, one for each giant. Where is this place? The Air Force man said to the BFG. I presume you can pinpoint it on the map.
Pinpoint, said the BFG. A map? I was never hearing these words before. Is this Air Force bean talking slush bungle?
The Air Marshal's face turned the colour of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue. BFG, can you tell us more or less where this giant country is?
No, Magister, not on my Nelly. Then we're jiggered, cried the Army General.
You mustn't be given up so easy, the BFG said calmly. The first titchy bobstacle you meet and you begin shouting you is Biff Squiggled. The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with fury.
Your Majesty, he cried, I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation.
The Queen, who was used to the tantrums of her senior officials, ignored him completely. BFG, she said, would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do?
A pleasure, Magister, said the BFG. Now listen to me carefully, you two boot-bogglers.
The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put.
I is not having the foggiest idea where giant country is in the world, but I is always able to gallop there. I is knowing the way very well, so all you is having to do is this. Put your 9 big belly poppers up in the air and let them follow me as I is galloping along.
How long will the journey take? The Queen asked.
If we is leaving now, the BFG said, we'll be arriving just as the giants is having their afternoon snozzle.
Splendid, said the Queen. Then, turning to the 2 military men, she said, prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said,
That's all very well, Your Majesty, but what are we going to do with the blighters once we've got them back?
Don't you worry about that, the Queen told him. We'll be ready for them. Hurry up now. Off you go. If it pleases Your Majesty, Sophie said, I should like to ride with the BFG to keep him company. Where will you sit? Asked the Queen. In his ear, Sophie said. Show them, BFG. The BFG got down from his high chair. He picked Sophie up in his fingers. He swiveled his huge right ear until it was parallel with the ground. Then he placed Sophie gently inside it. The heads of the Army and the Air Force stood there goggling. The Queen smiled. You really are rather a wonderful giant, she said.
Magister, the BFG said, I is wishing to ask a very special thing from you.
And what is it? The Queen said.
Could I please bring back here in the belly poppers all my collection of dreams? They's take me years and years to collect, and I is not wanting to lose them.
Why, of course, the Queen said. I wish you a safe journey. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from giant country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this, with 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head. He'd never before travelled in broad daylight either, but this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marvelled at the giant's speed and at the way he leapt across wide rivers and over huge houses.
but they hadn't seen anything yet.
"Be careful to hang on tight," the BFG said. "We is going fast as a fizzle crump."
The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "This place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clean off the last page." He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified.
"You don't mean to tell me we've gone right off the atlas?" he cried, leaning forward to look. "That's exactly what I am telling you," cried the Air Force man. "Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the old flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere here," he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. The young pilot was grinning broadly. The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this God-forsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue." "The giant has stopped," the young pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back the engines, and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "The giants is all just out of sight over there," the BFG told him. "But if you is taking these slush-buckling, noisy belly-poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel." "So, you want us to proceed by jeep?" the head of the army said. "Yes," the BFG said, "but you must all be very hushy-hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery-jokery." The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns," he cried. "Pig spiffle," the BFG said. "Those noises isn't guns." "Of course they're guns," shouted the head of the army. "I'm a military man and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back." "Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep." "Are you quite sure?" the army man said anxiously. Positive." "Proceed cautiously," the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50-feet-long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised a hand. The jeeps all stopped. The soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. "If any one of them is waking up, he'll gobble you down before you can say knack jife," the BFG answered, grinning hugely. The head of the army took several paces to the rear. "Go forward, men. Go forward, and do your duty bravely." The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains, all of them trembling mightily. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes
8 of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh-lump-eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh-lump-eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh-lump-eater opened his tiny, piggy, black eyes.
"Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, you rotsome man-hugger?"
Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse.
"Human beings!" the flesh-lump-eater yelled. "What is all you flash-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country?"
He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand.
"I is having early suppers today,"
he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching, horror-struck. "Do something!" she cried.
"Put that human being down!" the BFG shouted.
The flesh-lump-eater turned and stared at the BFG.
"What is you doing here, with all these grotty twiglets? You is making me very suspicious."
The BFG made a rush at the flesh-lump-eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the Queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly, she undid it.
"I is guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh-lump-eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there."
Sophie ran up behind the flesh-lump-eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch-long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh-lump-eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh-lump-eater was, saw his chance.
"You is bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seed it biting you. Oh, it was a frightsome poison-house viper. It was a dreadly dangerous windscreen viper." "Save our souls!" bellowed the flesh-lump-eater. "I is bitten by a septitious, venomsome windscreen viper."
He flopped to the ground and sat there, howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch.
"The teeth of the dreadly viper is still sticking into me," he yelled. "I is feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet."
The BFG saw his second chance.
"We must be getting those viper's teeth out of you at once," he cried. "Otherwise, you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you."
The BFG knelt down beside the flesh-lump-eater.
"You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That'll stop the poisonous juices from the venomsome viper going up your leg and into your heart."
The flesh-lump-eater grabbed his ankle with both hands.
"Now, close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the venomsome viper," the BFG said.
The terrified flesh-lump-eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signalled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh-lump-eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot.
"I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said, as he pulled the knot tight. "Well, do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before I's pizened to death." "There we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Well done, you!" Sophie cried. "Well done, you!" said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "You is saving all our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the Queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmozzle. "When you is only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you is sleeping extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the Army said. "I shall probably get a medal. Now, what's the next move?" "Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams," the BFG said. "We can't waste time with that rubbish," the Army General said. "It's the Queen's order," Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave, and the great dream-loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you got in there?" the head of the Army demanded to know. "Curiosity is killing the rat," the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants." The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead, and the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains.
"I is flash-bunkled,"
roared the flesh lump eater.
"I is split-swiggled,"
yelled the child chewer.
"I is swog-swalloped,"
bellowed the bone cruncher.
"I is goose-groggled,"
howled the man hugger.
"I is gunjel-swiped,"
shouted the meat dripper.
"I is flack-wangled,"
screamed the maid masher.
"I is slop-groggled,"
squawked the gizzard gulper.
"I is crod-squinkled,"
yowled the blood bottler.
"I is bop-mugged,"
screeched the butcher boy.
The 9 giant-carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then, very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilised to dig the colossal hole in which the 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field, and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant would still be some 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor, but they were still trussed up, and now came the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and do this, because the moment a giant was freed, he would be sure to turn on the wretched person who had freed him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer.
"I was told you before," he said. "Giants is never eaten giants. So I is going down, and I shall untie them myself before you can say Rack Jobinson."
With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down into the pit, the BFG was lowered on a rope. One by one he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in fury.
"Why is they putting us down here in this grub sludging hole?" they shouted at the BFG. "Because you is guzzling human beings. I was always warning you not to do it, and you is never taking the titchiest bit of notice." "In that case," the flesh lump eater bellowed, "I think we is guzzling you instead."
The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great, bulging sack he had brought with him from giant country lay at the top of the pit. "What's in there?" the Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black-and-white striped object the size of a man.
"Snos-cumbers," he cried. "This is the repulsant snos-cumber, Magister, and that is all we is going to give these disgustive giants from now on."
"May I taste it?" the Queen asked.
"Don't, Magister, don't," cried the BFG. "It is tasting of trogilth and pig squibble."
With that he tossed the snos-cumber down to the giants below.
"There's your supper," he shouted.
He fished out more snos-cumbers from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed.
"That serves 'em right, left and centre."
"What will we feed them on when the snos-cumbers are all used up?" the Queen asked him.
"Oh, they is never been used up, Magister," the BFG answered, smiling. "I is also bringing in this sack a whole bungle of snos-cumber plants, which I is giving, with your permission, to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we is having an everlasting supply of this repulsant food to feed these thirst-bloody giants on."
"What a clever fellow you are," the Queen said. "You're not very well educated, but you really are nobody's fool. I can see that." Every country in the world that had in the past been visited by the foul man-eating giants sent telegrams of congratulations and thanks to the BFG and to Sophie. Kings and presidents and prime ministers and rulers of every kind showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as all sorts of medals and presents. The ruler of India sent the BFG a magnificent elephant, the very thing he had been wishing for all his life. The King of Arabia sent them a camel each. The Lama of Tibet sent them a llama each. Wellington sent them 100 pairs of wellies each. Panama sent them beautiful hats. The King of Sweden sent them a barrel full of sweet and sour pork. Jersey sent them pullovers. There was no end to the gratitude of the world. The Queen herself gave orders that a special house with tremendous high ceilings and enormous doors should immediately be built in Windsor Great Park, next to her own castle for the BFG to live in, and a pretty little cottage was put up next door for Sophie. The BFG's house was to have a special dream-storing room with hundreds of shelves in it, where he could put his beloved bottles. What is more, he was given the title of the Royal Dream Blower. He was allowed to go galloping off to any place in England, on any night of the year, to blow his splendid fizz-wizards in through the windows to sleeping children, and letters poured into his house by the million from children begging him to pay them a visit. Meanwhile, tourists from all over the globe came flocking to gaze down in wonder at the 9 horrendous man-eating giants in the great pit. They came especially at feeding time, when the snos-cumbers were being thrown down to them by the keeper, and it was a pleasure to listen to the howls and growls of horror coming up from the pit, as the giants began to chew upon the filthiest-tasting vegetable on earth. There was only one disaster. 3 silly men who had drunk too much beer for lunch decided to climb over the high fence surrounding the pit, and of course they fell in. There were yells of delight from the giants below, followed by the crunching of bones. The head keeper immediately put up a big notice on the fence saying, "It is forbidden to feed the giants," and after that there were no more disasters. The BFG expressed a wish to learn how to speak properly, and Sophie herself, who loved him as she would a father, volunteered to give him lessons every day. He became a tremendous reader. He read all of Charles Dickens, whom he no longer called Dahl's Chickens, and all of Shakespeare, and literally thousands of other books. He also started to write essays about his own past life. When Sophie read some of them, she said, "These are very good. I think perhaps one day you could become a real writer."
"Oh, I would love that," cried the BFG. "Do you think I could?"
"I know you could. Why don't you start by writing a book about you and me?"
"Very well," the BFG said. "I'll give it a try."
So he did. He worked hard on it, and in the end he completed it. Rather shyly he showed it to the Queen. The Queen read it aloud to her grandchildren. And then the Queen said, "I think we ought to get this book printed properly and published so that other children can read it." This was arranged, but because the BFG was a very modest giant, he wouldn't put his own name on it. He used somebody else's name instead. But where, you might ask, is this book that the BFG wrote? It's right here. You've just finished listening to it. This audiobook was produced and published by Penguin Books Limited.